I always thought silence was comforting. For most of my married life, silence meant peace. No arguments, no slammed doors, no raised voices. Just the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock on the kitchen wall, and Ethan's deep breathing beside me at night. But lately, silence had become something else. It was heavier now, thicker, like fog settling over a field after a storm. It filled the house like smoke from an invisible fire, suffocating, unavoidable. Ethan used to come home humming, tossing his tie on the chair, pulling me into a quick kiss before heading straight to the shower. Now he came home late, moving like a man carrying a secret too heavy for his pockets. I'd ask him about his meetings, and he'd answer with that same tired smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Work's crazy this week, Maya," he'd say, brushing past me to pour himself a drink. At first, I believed him. Or maybe I wanted to. After 10 years of marriage, you learn to ignore the small cracks because you're terrified they'll lead to a collapse. But the cracks had become too deep to hide. The late-night texts that made him smile at his phone, the sudden gym membership, even though he always said treadmills were fur hamsters. The scent of an unfamiliar perfume that clung to his shirts, sweet, floral, and completely out of place in our home, that smelled of coffee and cinnamon candles. That night, I couldn't sleep. Ethan had claimed he was staying late at the office again. I'd stopped waiting for him hours ago. I sat at the kitchen counter with a mug of tea gone cold, watching the clock hands crawl past midnight. My phone buzzed. A text from him. "Don't wait up. I'm exhausted. Love you." I stared at those two words, "love you," until they blurred into meaninglessness. Love? No. Whatever we had now wasn't love. It was habit, routine, a shared address, and a fading promise. I wandered toward the garage, maybe just to distract myself, maybe out of instinct. His car was there, parked crookedly as if he'd left in a hurry earlier. The interior light flicked on when I opened the door, spilling a pale glow on the leather seats. Something caught my eye, a small silver tube peeking out from the glove compartment. My curiosity sparked before my fear could stop me. I reached for it. When I held it in my hand, I felt my stomach twist. It wasn't lotion, it wasn't toothpaste. It was personal lubricant. And not just any kind, the kind that didn't belong in a marriage running on silence. I froze. The room around me seemed to shrink, the air thick and heavy. For a long moment, I just stared at it, feeling my pulse drum in my ears. 1,000 thoughts hit me at once. Denial, rage, disbelief. My first instinct was to confront him, to throw it at his face, to scream and demand the truth. But then a darker part of me whispered, "No, not yet." The thoughts startled me. I wasn't usually the vengeful type. I was a quiet woman, a baker by profession, patient by nature. But something inside me had snapped. Years of emotional neglect, of subtle lies, of being treated like background noise in my own life. They all converged in that moment. I felt my heart harden in a way I never had before. I slipped the tube back into the glove box, closed it gently, and stood there for a while, staring at my reflection in the window. My face looked calm. Too calm. My lips curved into a faint smile that even I didn't recognize. "Okay, Ethan, if you want to play games, I'll show you how it's done." When I went back inside, the house looked different. Not physically, but something in the air had shifted. The photos on the wall, the wedding portrait above the fireplace, the souvenir mug from our honeymoon in Maui, they all looked like props in a story that was never real. I sat back down at the kitchen counter and opened my laptop. I didn't Google how to confront a cheating husband. I Googled how to make someone regret cheating. Most of the results were clickbait nonsense, but one forum post caught my eye. A woman describing how she caught her husband cheating and replaced his shampoo with hair removal cream. The comments were full of laughter and applause emojis. I laughed too. A small, strange laugh that made me sound like a stranger to myself. Then I looked toward the garage door again. That small silver tube flashed in my mind like a signal, and that's when the idea began to take shape. I wouldn't scream, I wouldn't cry, I wouldn't give Ethan the satisfaction of seeing me broken. I'd do something far better, something unforgettable. My mind was already racing ahead, plotting every detail like a chess player setting up the board. The thought of revenge didn't just thrill me, it steadied me. For the first time in months, I felt in control again. I imagined his face when he realized what I'd done. Imagined the chaos, the embarrassment. It wouldn't just be justice, it would be art. The kind of poetic irony only betrayal can inspire. By the time Ethan stumbled home that night, smelling faintly of wine and guilt, I was already smiling to myself. He looked at me with tired eyes and said, "You're still up?" I nodded and said softly, "Yeah, just couldn't sleep." He yawned, kissed my cheek half-heartedly, and went upstairs. I watched him go, feeling nothing. Not love, not hate, just a calm anticipation, like the quiet before a storm. He had no idea that his world, our world, was about to change forever. The next morning, I woke with a plan, settling in like armor. Revenge needs discipline, not drama, I told myself that, as I tied my hair back and warmed the oven for the day's first batch of scones. Baking had always been my therapy, tactile, exact, forgiving. Flour on my hands steadied my thoughts. I moved through the kitchen with a calm that felt practiced and dangerous at the same time. The house hummed with the ordinary noises of our life, but to me, every sound had an edge now. The kettle's whistle was a clock ticking down. The creak in the stair was a footstep toward betrayal. I forced myself to keep the face of a woman who knew nothing, because rage shows its hand quickly. Patience, on the other hand, wins empires. I needed proof, undeniable, irrefutable proof that would justify what I planned and make the moment of reveal cinematic and absolute. I started small, like a detective charting a case. At first it was mundane, receipts, odd calendar entries, the faint perfume still clinging to his collars. But the mundane is where affairs hide. They are a collage of small betrayals stitched together. I logged into our shared email account with an insomnia-fooled precision and went through messages while the bread rose. There it was again, an unfamiliar contact name, a string of messages that sounded like private jokes and late-night flirtation. I took screenshots, saved them to a hidden folder labeled grocery lists, a ridiculous title that made me smile. I copied dates, times, and small phrases that stung more than any slur. Each screenshot made my jaw harden a little more. Each one sat like a pebble in my pocket, heavy and impossible to dismiss. When Ethan left that afternoon saying he had a client meeting out of town, Dallas, he said with an air of annoyance, when I asked too many questions, I watched him go. He kissed me on the forehead in that perfunctory way he'd learned from sitcoms, and drove off, leaving the house lighter by his absence, but heavier by the truths I was collecting. I didn't call his office, I didn't follow him yet. Instead, I put on my coat and drove to a thrift store 2 neighborhoods over, pretending to myself that my errand was about candles or fabric. I sat in my car with the engine off and scrolled through his social media from earlier weeks. A tagged photo of him at a small candle-lit restaurant, a comment chain, a check-in at a spa. Nothing overtly illicit, but everything pointing to a life that didn't include me. It's amazing how the internet preserves the small betrayals that real life tries to blur. That evening, while making a fresh batch of lemon curd, I called a woman who once worked with Ethan, a friendly neighbor from our block who kept her ear to our street. I didn't say I was looking for dirt. I asked casually about dinner dates, business trips, and whether Ethan had mentioned being in San Antonio recently. People like gossip. They also like to be helpful. She told me about a rumor, a dinner, a bottle of wine left on someone's review page, a cheeky emoji that meant more than it should. I thanked her and hung up, my mind already counting possibilities. Each tiny corroboration made the picture clearer and uglier. Not a one-night fling, but a carefully hidden relationship that had been fed with texts
and small untruths until it had grown into a thing utterly alien to our marriage. My next step was deliberate cruelty in the most surgical sense. I needed to catch them in the act without becoming the melodramatic wreck the internet loves to watch. I wanted control over the reveal, the angle, the timing, the satisfaction. So I trailed him once. Not stalking, I told myself. Observing. He met her at a yoga studio they both frequented, a bright, plant-filled room smelling of eucalyptus and earnest sweat. He touched her shoulder in a way he never touched me in public. When they hugged, something in my chest shifted. My hands shook so hard I had to steady the steering wheel. I took pictures from a distance, careful to be a ghost. The photos were grainy but telling. A wine bottle in the background, 2 coffee cups, the easy intimacy of people who had forged a secret rhythm. That night, I replayed everything in my mind like a rehearsal. The receipts, the messages, the photographs. They assembled themselves into an accusation that required a bold reply. I imagined confronting him over dinner and watching his face contort the way it always did when he was cornered. But I dismissed that fantasy for something colder and cleaner. The tube in the glove compartment was still there in my memory, an object that had contained intimacy and now hummed with betrayal. If I could flip that object into a symbol of consequence, then humiliation would be an art form, not a tantrum. The idea of replacing that lubricant with glue began as a dark joke in the back of my mind. I laughed at it then, a short, sharp sound that felt like shattering glass. But humor is often the first cousin of bravery, and in that tiny laugh I found the nerve to plan. Preparation became ritual. I bought a tube of industrial-strength superglue under the least conspicuous pretext I could invent, a repair kit for a cracked ceramic pie dish I never told anyone I owned. I bought a small syringe, too. I'd need to be precise. Details matter when you're staging a memory. At home, late at night, I sat at the kitchen table with the glue and a replacement lube tube I'd bought online, identical to the one I'd found. I emptied the lube into a sealed bag and cleaned the tube until it looked like brand new. My hands were steady now, steadier than they had been at any point in the last 6 months. I refilled the tube carefully with glue, sealed it with a neat clinical fold, and taped it back so it looked untouched. Each movement was methodical, almost reverent. This wasn't about cruelty for cruelty's sake, but about reclaiming power with the precision of a sculptor. When I placed the sealed tube back into the glove compartment, I felt like a composer finishing the final note of a symphony. The plan was in motion. I went to bed that night feeling oddly serene, as if a balance had shifted. It wasn't satisfaction, it was the calm of someone who had decided to stop being a passive character in her own life. There was danger in what I'd done, of course. Legal, ethical, emotional dangers that flickered in my thoughts like warning lights. But the weight of the proof I'd gathered made the risk feel tolerable. I was no longer waiting for him to betray me. I had set the stage where his betrayal would do the revealing for me. In the dark, I pictured him unsuspecting, driving to a rendezvous with the same arrogance that had allowed him to be cruel. And I pictured the look on his face when something he used for pleasure became the instrument of his humiliation.
The weekend came with a brittle, bright weather that felt almost celebratory, as if the world itself were conspiring to make my small, dark plan look theatrical. I told myself I would be invisible. I had rehearsed this role of the casual, unsuspecting wife so many times in the last weeks that it had become muscle memory. Ethan left that Friday afternoon with a kiss that lacked urgency, a casual, distracted peck that said more about habit than affection. I watched him drive away, the taillights disappearing around the corner, and then I did the thing I never thought I would. I sat in my car down the street from the little house they'd rented for the weekend and waited. I told myself my intention was only to confirm what I already knew, to collect the final image of his betrayal so that I could close the book forever. But as the sky shifted from blue to the bruised purple of dusk, something else settled in, a strange, fierce anticipation, like hunger that had been fed for too long and now needed the single bite that would quiet it. I watched through the trees as Ethan's figure crossed the porch. Then the door opened and Leela appeared, smaller than I'd imagined, lithe in a sundress, hair piled messily on her head, laughter spilling into the evening as if unaware of the gravity that had tied itself to those two simple people. They moved like two actors in a play I'd seen their lines for. They fit together in a way that made my stomach drop and my pulse climb. I had always loved details. How someone stirred their coffee, the cadence of their laugh, the way they tucked hair behind an ear. Now those small things were evidence, a dossier of intimacy that had been built without me. Ethan kissed her the way I had once imagined he kissed me, with abandon and delight, and I felt something cold and bright crack across my chest. For a heartbeat, I imagined stepping forward and tearing the world apart with a single shouted name. But the other life I'd cultivated, the careful, quiet strategist, kept my feet still and my breath steady. I watched and recorded this final proof not out of cruelty, but because this was my story to end. Inside the house, the evening moved with ridiculous normalcy. Candles, soft music, the clink of glasses. I could see them through a small gap in the hedges. Hands brushing, knees touching under the table, the kind of private conversation that writes itself into small conspiracies. There was a moment when Leela leaned forward, the candlelight catching a laugh in her eyes, and Ethan's face softened in a way I hadn't seen in years. The sight of his ease, the way he let his guard down completely, was the sting I had been feeling for months made real. I felt both small and enormous at once, like something inside me had folded and refolded itself into a new shape. This was the scene I had prepared for, the scene that would be burned into the memory of anyone who deserved to witness justice. Then the noise began, first faint, then louder. A shout, a clatter, the startled cry of someone surprised by pain. I saw Ethan rise suddenly, a half step, then stumble as Leela made a distressed sound. Their hands flew together instinctively. For a second, I couldn't parse the movement. My brain scrambled with images and assumed outcomes. Maybe an argument, maybe a fall down the stairs. But the way they both froze, the way their hands clenched, as if grasping for something that had betrayed them, changed the whole tenor of the scene. Leela's face went white. Ethan's mouth opened and he tried to pull away. The tableau that sprang into my head, ridiculous, awful, sharp, was the moment of truth. The intimacy that binds had become the very thing that trapped them. From where I sat hidden in my car, the world narrowed to two figures on a porch, hands stuck together in a way that looked grotesquely intimate and impossibly stuck. Neighbors appeared like a chorus, drawn by the noise. A dog barked a high, frantic note. Someone called out to ask if they were okay. Ethan's voice, a sound I had heard in grocery store aisles and behind closed doors, rose, first thick with embarrassment, then panicked. Leela was crying, her face contorted with a mix of shock and shame. I felt a version of triumph, yes, but it was tempered now by a flicker of something else, the sudden, unsettling recognition that humiliation is a blunt instrument and that the person who wields it cannot control all the splinters. Flashing lights painted the street in frantic blue and red as a patrol car arrived, followed by a small crowd of neighbors who hovered at the edges, peering in with the voracious curiosity only communities can summon. Someone, a neighbor I'd waved to at summer barbecues, dialed 911, voice shaking as she reported the bizarre scene. "They're stuck together. Something's glued them. We can't separate them," she said, the words tumbling out like a question that had to be true, if only because it was so absurd. The fire engine that answered the call came not long after, a beast of steel and flashing lights that roared down our street and parked with practiced urgency. Men in turnout gear jumped out and moved with a cohesion that made my chest tighten. I watched them kneel, assess, and open their equipment with a business-like calm that felt almost surreal against the private calamity playing out on the porch. They spoke softly to the trapped couple, offering reassurances that sounded like lifelines across a gulf. The firefighters' hands were professional but gentle. They wrapped a cloth around the area, checked for swelling, murmured instructions to keep them calm. I saw one of them look up and scan the crowd, then look in my direction. Not at me exactly, but to the general place where I was hiding. For a second, I imagined my face turning pale under the streetlight, but I kept still. The scene felt like a stage production where the lead actor had lost control of his costume. Absurd, embarrassing, painful. As the rescue unfolded, part of me cataloged it all with the clinical detachment of an editor cutting a scene from maximum impact. Flashing lights, the wet gleam of the porch, the way a stranger holds someone else's hand in a crisis. But another part of me, the quieter part that had been bruised for years, watched with a strange, aching sympathy. Either way, the neighbors watched. Phones came up like black, glowing witnesses, and someone recorded the muffled exchanges and the firefighters' quiet professionalism. I thought about how quickly private moments become public spectacles, how humiliation moves from the bedroom to the curb in the span of a single breath. I felt an odd surge of regret amid the satisfaction, a prickly awareness of consequence that gnawed at the edges of my triumph. They were taken to the hospital that night, not because of flames, but because medical staff needed to ensure that no lasting damage had been done. Paramedics helped stabilize them, wrapped them, and checked vital signs with the efficiency of people trained to see beyond spectacle to safety. I watched the ambulance doors close and the siren fade while my car sat like a stone in the dark. In that empty silence, the enormity of what had happened settled in with a heavy, complicated weight. I had executed my plan with surgical calm. I had watched betrayal meet consequence in a way the world would retell and laugh at. But I had also watched human bodies in distress, heard laughter turn to shock and tears, and watched strangers become the vessels of my revenge. The public attention, the stares, the videos, the inevitable gossip would ripple outward in ways I could not fully control. In the quiet after the sirens, in the thin, brittle light of dawn that would come hours later, I realized the truth any story of vengeance eventually reveals. The satisfaction of... The ambulance light washed the kitchen in a cold, clinical blue when I finally drove home, but the house felt alien, like a set left standing after the cameras had packed up. I parked in the dark and sat for a long time with my hands on the wheel, feeling the engine hum like a metronome marking the pace of a life I'd interrupted. My phone buzzed twice in my pocket, once with a message from an unknown number asking if I'd seen the commotion, and again with a missed call from a neighbor. I didn't answer. I didn't know which voice would sound worse, a neighbor's loud curiosity, a friend's shocked disappointment, or Ethan's pleading. Inside, the silence felt swollen and unfamiliar. It pressed against my ears until I could hear only my breath and the faint echo of the firefighters' calm commands. I told myself I had done what I needed to do, that it was theater, poetic justice, a line drawn in the sand. But when I opened the front door and stepped into the house, our house, the weight of what I'd set in motion landed like a physical thing on my chest. The wedding portrait above the fireplace seemed to judge me with its permanent smile. I walked past the living room as if in a trance, hands trailing along the back of the couch the way one might check for warmth after touching a stove. The house smelled like lemon and old wood. It smelled like a life I had both loved and outgrown. I went to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping where he'd left it warm the night before. The phone in my pocket vibrated again. This time it was his name. Ethan, lighting my screen with a familiarity that made my stomach flip. I let it ring out. Let him leave a message. If he wanted to beg, to explain, to collapse into the role of the wounded and repentant, he could do it without me pressing play for the performance. The voicemail was short, ragged. Maya, please come to the hospital. It's not what it looks like. Call me. His voice broke on the last syllable the way it had broken when he learned of his father's death years ago. I felt something simultaneously tender and furious stir inside me, like a hand trying to steal the hammer from my grip. Night bled into morning with a sluggish, guilty pace. I went to the bakery because routine is a kind of armor. Measuring the right ratio of flour to butter is a task that refuses to be moralized, and in the clarity of the ovens, I could convince myself I was simply doing my job. Customers came and left, small talk bouncing off the glass display. A woman in a raincoat, the same neighborhood called 911, stood at the counter and watched my hands shape dough with an intensity that made me think of interrogation. She whispered something about poor Ethan and so shameful, and left a folded grocery list on the counter like a confession. My hands didn't tremble in public. They moved with the same practiced steadiness that had shaped the plan. At noon, the news app on my phone pinged with an alert. A short article about a bizarre rescue the night before. 2 adults stuck together on a porch, local firefighters praised for their swift response. The headline used the words odd and embarrassing, and beneath the flippant tone, the story sketched the outline of what I already knew. There was a grainy photo taken from across the street, a smear of images that had been captured by a neighbor's phone. My stomach turned. People were already telling the story, retelling it, retouching the facts into jokes and incredulous commentary. Public spectacle moves fast. Reputations shred faster. Word traveled, as it does, in small, cutting ways. At the bakery, a regular, a man who had once been polite, now a little too conspiratorial, raised an eyebrow and said, "Small world, huh?" A woman who used to bring her children to my baking classes sniffed and dropped her voice when she asked if my marriage was okay. Social media bloomed with variations of the same crude humor. Memes would be made, jokes would travel, and strangers would have opinions about a life I alone had tried to manage. The thought of the internet turning my private hurt into a punchline pinched at something raw inside me. And yet at the same time, I felt the steady satisfaction of someone who had rewritten the script. People would say cruel things, but they would also whisper, perhaps with a grin or secret admiration, about the audacity of a woman who'd taken control. That ambivalence was mine to hold. By late afternoon, Ethan's brother called. I hadn't spoken to him much over the years. Family had a way of fragmenting when secrets lodged like splinters. He was confused and angry, and his voice had the sharpness of someone trying to place the blame he didn't yet understand. "Maya, what happened? Is he okay?" he demanded. I could hear the hospital beeping in the background, a low, steady rhythm that made me picture monitors and antiseptic light. I told him, in a voice that tried to be neutral, that I was aware of what happened and that I had my reasons. His silence on the other. By the time I finally decided to go to the hospital, 2 days had passed. I told myself it wasn't guilt that drove me there, just curiosity, closure, the need to see the aftermath of a story I had authored. The hospital parking lot shimmered under a harsh midday sun, the air thick with the metallic smell of disinfectant and burnt coffee. I parked near the emergency wing, my fingers drumming against the steering wheel as if trying to find a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. When I walked through those automatic glass doors, I became a ghost slipping back into a world I had already left behind. The receptionist didn't even glance up as I gave Ethan's name, and in that moment, I was grateful for anonymity. The world still didn't know that the woman behind the glue and the scandal was standing quietly in a blue cardigan, carrying a paper bag of muffins she didn't intend to give. The walk down the corridor felt endless, fluorescent lights flickering above like interrogation lamps. Room 312. The number glowed faintly on the metal plate as I stopped outside the door. I could hear his voice before I saw him, the low murmur of someone trying to explain the unexplainable. "It was an accident," he said to someone. Maybe a nurse, maybe Leela. "We thought it was, just personal stuff." The word personal landed like a bruise. I pushed the door slightly open, just enough to see the edge of the room. Ethan sat propped up on the bed, bandages on his hand, face pale and drawn. His eyes had lost their arrogance, replaced by a raw, bewildered shame. Leela sat beside him, her hand wrapped in gauze, staring down at the linoleum floor. The tension between them was palpable, thick with the silence of two people who had shared humiliation more intimate than any love could endure. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for them. There was something pitiful in their stillness, like two children caught stealing, forced to sit in the wreckage of their choices. But Kitty is a fickle emotion, and mine evaporated the moment Ethan lifted his gaze and saw me in the doorway. His eyes widened, flickering with recognition, disbelief, and a flash of fear. "You came," he said, his voice trembling between gratitude and accusation. "Why?" I let a small smile curve my lips. Not cruel, just calm. "I wanted to see what honesty looks like when it finally shows up," I said softly. The nurse excused herself quickly, sensing the storm beneath the quiet. Leela shifted uncomfortably, clutching her bandaged hand to her chest. "We didn't mean," she began, but I cut her off with a look sharp enough to silence her. "You didn't mean to get caught," I said. "That's what you didn't mean." Ethan's mouth opened and closed like a fish, gasping for air. For once, the man who always had excuses had none. He reached out as if to touch my hand, but the IV line tugged slightly and reminded him of his confinement. "Maya, please, this isn't who you are." I tilted my head. "You have no idea who I am. You knew the wife who baked you bread and paid your bills. You didn't know the woman who'd finally stopped forgiving." Leela stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. "You could have killed us," she snapped, her voice shaking more from shame than anger. I took a slow step inside the room, my heels clicking softly against the tile. "You're alive," I said, "and so is the lesson." Ethan looked at her with pleading eyes, but she turned away, her face blotched with red. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Machines beeped softly, reminders that time was still moving as even our lives had split into before and after. I placed the bag of muffins on the small bedside table. "For the nurses," I said. "They've cleaned up enough of your mess already." Ethan's shoulder sagged, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've destroyed me, Maya." I met his eyes steadily. "No," I said. "You destroyed yourself. I just handed you the mirror." There was no shouting, no tears, no grand emotional crescendo, just the quiet collapse of a man who finally saw the full weight of his actions. When I turned to leave, I caught my reflection in the window, calm, composed, not the hysterical woman I once feared I'd become. The nurse passed me in the hallway, offering a small, knowing nod, as if she too understood that some stories end not with forgiveness, but with balance restored. Outside, the sun was brighter than before, the world buzzing with ordinary life, a reminder that even the most extraordinary betrayals eventually fade into background noise. But as I walked back to my car, one thought pulsed through my mind, steady and undeniable. Revenge, once tasted, is never sweet, but it's unforgettable. By the end of that week, the story had spread like wildfire, faster than any gossip, faster than any truth could ever travel. What began as a whispered rumor among neighbors had turned into a full-blown viral phenomenon. The headline was everywhere. Couples stuck together after bedroom mishap, firefighters to the rescue. There were memes, tweets, TikToks, reaction videos, and endless comments from strangers who laughed, speculated, and tore apart the details of a life they knew nothing about. I watched it unfold from my living room, each post a small spark in the digital inferno. At first, I tried to look away, telling myself that detachment was dignity. But curiosity, that old familiar devil, always won. The world had turned my act of vengeance into entertainment, and while part of me felt exposed, another part couldn't help but admire how swiftly karma had gone viral. I didn't tell anyone it was me, not my friends from church, not the regulars at my bakery, not even my sister who called every morning to check in. They all had opinions, of course, strong ones. Some people are just sick, my sister muttered. How could anyone be so stupid? Others joked about it, shaking their heads and laughing as if life's absurdities had no real victims. I'd nod, play along, even laugh sometimes. No one suspected that the woman making their coffee and pastries had orchestrated the humiliation the world couldn't stop talking about. But at night, when the laughter from the internet faded into the stillness of my house, the silence returned, thicker than before. It was strange, being both invisible and omnipresent. The world was mocking Ethan and Lila, but I was the ghost author of their downfall, haunting the comment section under fake usernames, scrolling through thousands of reactions that ranged from disbelief to delight. And then the tone began to shift. The mockery turned to outrage. People started asking who would do such a thing? Who could be so psychotic or vindictive? Feminist forums debated whether it was empowerment or abuse. Relationship podcasts used the story as a what not to do cautionary tale. The news cycle had moved on from shock to analysis, and I suddenly realized how easily the internet builds heroes only to tear them apart. A few conspiracy threads even claimed the story was fake, that no real woman would go that far. Others called me, though they didn't know it was me, a legend, a queen of poetic justice. That paradox made me smile bitterly. To half the world, I was a monster. To the other half, a symbol of power, and neither of them really knew me. Ethan, of course, wasn't silent for long. He'd always been a storyteller, especially when the story painted him as the victim. A week after the incident, he went on a local news interview, sitting stiffly beside his brother, his hand still bandaged. It was a misunderstanding. I've been betrayed in a way no one deserves. I watched from the bakery's back office, my jaw tight. He wasn't apologizing for cheating. He was rebranding himself as the man who'd been attacked. Lila stayed out of sight, probably nursing the wounds of both her pride and her reputation. Her friends unfollowed her, her job quietly restructured her position, and her name became a punchline. Ethan, on the other hand, began receiving messages of sympathy. Some even called him brave. The audacity made my stomach twist. But here's the truth about revenge. It doesn't freeze time. It doesn't stop the world from reshaping itself around the wreckage. I had imagined satisfaction to feel like victory, a clean cut through the tangled web of deceit. Instead, it felt like standing in the middle of a wildfire I had started, watching it spread in directions I couldn't control. My bakery saw more customers than ever, curiosity disguised as support. Some wanted to see the woman from the viral town. Others just wanted to whisper and speculate. I smiled, served them cinnamon rolls, and listened as they retold my story in their versions, each one further from the truth, yet somehow more believable. At night, I would sit by the window, the glow of my phone lighting my face as I scrolled through comment sections like a confession booth. She's insane. She's iconic. She's dangerous. She's brilliant. The contradictions were endless, and I began to wonder if I had become the very thing Ethan once accused me of: unpredictable, emotional, unstable. But deep down, I knew it wasn't madness that had driven me. It was the quiet ache of years of betrayal, the humiliation of loving someone who thought I'd never fight back. The glue hadn't just bonded them together that night. It had sealed the truth in a way no lie could dissolve. Still, I couldn't ignore the creeping sense that the story was no longer mine. The internet had chewed it up, digested it, and spit it out as viral content, stripped of its pain, dressed in laughter. And somewhere beneath all that noise, I began to miss the simplicity of being unknown. Revenge had given me power, but anonymity had given me peace. Now, I had neither.
It started small. A few whispers when I walked into the grocery store, the way people's eyes lingered a second too long when I passed by, the subtle shifts in tone when they greeted me. At first, I told myself it was paranoia. the residue of guilt that clung to me like the faint scent of smoke after a fire. But soon, the whispers grew teeth. One afternoon, a woman at the bakery counter smiled too brightly and said, "You must be so proud, all that attention online." I froze for a second, unsure if it was sarcasm or genuine curiosity. Then she winked and added, "Between us girls, I'd have done worse." She laughed as if she'd just complimented me, but her words made my stomach tighten. Pride and shame are strange siblings. They often show up together, wearing the same face. I realized then that my secret wasn't as secret as I thought. People were guessing, connecting dots, and the small town I lived in had never been good at keeping gossip contained. By the end of the week, the bakery that had once been my sanctuary started to feel like a stage. Customers came not for pastries, but for a performance, to see the woman who glued her husband. I caught them whispering behind napkins, pretending to scroll through their phones while sneakily taking pictures. A local vlogger even came in, pretending to film a food review, but her lens lingered too long on me. Later that night, her video went up online. I visited the bakery of the viral glue wife. It hit 200,000 views in 2 days. My sales went up, sure, but the laughter that filled my shop wasn't the warm, familiar kind I'd built my life around. It was sharp, invasive, and cruel. The internet had found a way into my front door, and it refused to leave. Then came the hate. A fake account started leaving comments on my business page, calling me toxic, abusive, dangerous. One even said, "You should be arrested." I suspected Ethan. The tone was too familiar, a blend of arrogance and self-pity. I reported the comments, deleted a few, but the damage was already done. People were divided. Some defended me, others condemned me. My story had become a morality debate, a tug-of-war between justice and cruelty. Every morning, I'd wake up to another post, another opinion about a life that used to be private. Strangers who'd never known my name were now experts on my marriage. And through it all, Ethan stayed quiet, which I knew meant he was planning something. That something came one evening when I turned on the local news. There he was, Ethan, sitting in a studio, wearing a bandaged hand like a medal. He said, "I don't want revenge," he said softly, his voice trembling just enough for sympathy. "I just want people to know that I forgive her." My heart went cold. Forgive me? The audacity was almost breathtaking. The interviewer, a woman with too much mascara and too little curiosity, leaned forward. "Do you think she regrets it?" Ethan gave a long, weary sigh. "She's not the same woman I married," he said. "She's been lost for years." He let the silence do the rest. The performance was perfect, subtle, manipulative, and utterly convincing. Within hours, the internet shifted again. The comments that once called me a legend now called me a lunatic. The next morning, my bakery windows were covered with sticky notes, half supportive, half vicious. "You're my hero. You're a disgrace. Karma queen. Psychopath." The colors of the notes looked like confetti, but the words were bullets. I stood there for a long time reading them all, one by one. And for the first time since this all began, I felt something close to fear. Not because of Ethan or the police or even public judgment, but because I realized I had lost control of the story entirely. It no longer belonged to me. It belonged to the crowd, faceless, restless, hungry for drama. Still, deep inside that storm, a new resolve began to form. I wouldn't hide. I wouldn't apologize. Ethan could craft his narrative, but I still had truth. And truth, once spoken, has a way of burning through lies like sunlight through fog. So that night, I opened my laptop, took a deep breath, and began to write my version of events. No embellishments, no dramatics, just the truth. Raw, ugly, human. My fingers trembled as I typed the title, "My Husband Cheated, and This Is What Really Happened."
The decision to write my side of the story was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. I sat at my kitchen table, the same one where I had first discovered the tube of lubricant, laptop open, fingers hovering above the keyboard as though I were holding a scalpel. Every keystroke felt like both confession and defiance. I began by recounting the months of subtle betrayals, the unexplained absences, the faint perfume that clung to his collars, the little lies that stacked up until they formed a mountain I could no longer ignore. I wrote about Ethan's smirks and evasions, the dinners that didn't include me, the carefully hidden texts, and the moment I discovered incontrovertible proof. I didn't hold back. This wasn't about shame or performance, it was about truth, a weapon I could wield with precision. Once I detailed the events leading up to the glue incident, I described the night itself with surgical clarity, but without malice. I left out any gratuitous details meant to humiliate. Instead, I focused on the shock, the absurdity, and the lessons I had learned. I wanted readers to understand that revenge isn't just about causing pain, it's about reclaiming control, asserting dignity, and exposing deception. As I typed the words, a strange sense of liberation spread through me. It was as if I were exhaling all the tension, all the anger, all the years of betrayal, letting them leave my body and take their place in the narrative where they belonged, outside of me. I hesitated before clicking publish, my finger hovering over the trackpad. What if the world heeded me? What if I became the villain instead of the voice of truth? But the thought of letting Ethan control the story any longer, letting him spin sympathy and shame into a weapon, was unbearable. I clicked. The post went live. Within minutes, the first wave of reactions hit. Comments poured in, some supportive, some skeptical, some incredulous. Finally, someone tells the truth. She had every right to do that. Unbelievable. A few even expressed empathy for Ethan and Lila, but the balance had shifted. The narrative was mine now. I wasn't just a character in someone else's story. I was the author of my own life once again. The virality of the post was immediate. Shares, retweets, and notifications flooded in. Influencers picked it up, dissecting it on live streams. Podcasts debated the ethics, and forums became battlegrounds of opinion. Some labeled me cunning and fearless. Others called me vengeful and reckless. But amidst all the noise, there was clarity. My story had resonance. People related to betrayal, deception, and the need to reclaim power. For once, I felt seen, not as a punchline, not as a meme, but as a human being who had endured and responded. Yet, reclaiming my narrative didn't erase the emotional fallout. Ethan, of course, tried to respond. He issued a half-hearted statement claiming he was misunderstood, that the post painted him unfairly. Lila disappeared from social media, probably nursing the same shame that had gripped her the night of the incident. I watched their reactions carefully, noting the cracks in their performance. Meanwhile, friends and family began treating me differently. Some were in awe, some were cautious, and a few quietly judged. The attention was exhausting, but I understood something crucial. Truth, once released, has its own momentum. It cannot be undone, only carried forward. By the end of the week, a sense of equilibrium settled over me. The world was still talking, still laughing, still debating, but my voice was clear amidst the clamor. I had taken the chaos, betrayal, and absurdity and turned it into something that was mine. For the first time in months, I slept without planning, without scheming, without the gnawing anxiety of what might be hidden around the next corner. The glue incident was over. The humiliation had been public, and the narrative had shifted. I was no longer a silent observer of my own life. I was the author, the voice, and the woman who had finally, unequivocally, taken back her power.
The weeks that followed felt surreal, like living in a half-dream where reality was distorted by the reactions of others. My bakery continued to thrive, not just because of my pastries, but because people were drawn to the woman behind the story, the woman who had dared to expose betrayal and reclaim her power in such an unforgettable way. Some customers came just to meet me, to witness the calm confidence of someone who had endured public humiliation and turned it into strength. Others whispered when I walked past, the tone ranging from admiration to suspicion. Social media followed me like a shadow. Every post, every photo, every story became fodder for commentary. It was exhausting, but I had expected this. I had chosen to step into the light. Ethan's presence lingered,
even in absence. Though he and Lila had retreated from the public eye, their reputations were fractured beyond repair. He called a few times, his voice hesitant and carefully neutral. "Maya, can we talk?" I listened without responding. Every call felt like a test of willpower, a reminder that even though I had reclaimed my narrative, the consequences of my actions would follow me for months, maybe years. Lila, on the other hand, disappeared completely, a ghost in the social fabric of our town. Rumors swirled that she had moved to another city, changed her job, and tried to erase the traces of her part in the scandal. But the internet remembers. People who had captured photos, taken videos, or simply watched the story unfold were not so quick to forget. Among the most unexpected ripples were the reactions of friends and family. Some praised me quietly, in hushed tones, for having the courage to stand up for myself. Others distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the chaos I had orchestrated, unsure how to reconcile the friend they had known with the woman the world now watched unfold online. Even casual acquaintances treated me differently, as if my life had become a cautionary tale, a narrative they could retell in order to warn or entertain. Each interaction carried the weight of notoriety, forcing me to navigate a social landscape that was both familiar and foreign. It was an education in power, perception, and the fragility of reputation. The emotional consequences were no less complicated. In the quiet moments, I found myself replaying the entire chain of events, from the discovery of the lubricant to the night the firefighters arrived, and wondering about the cost. Satisfaction was immediate, sharp, almost intoxicating, but reflection brought a new dimension: empathy for the human chaos I had created. Ethan's panic, Lila's shame, the neighbor's shock, and the medic's professional but concerned demeanor, all of it formed a mosaic of reality I had intervened in. Revenge had delivered a spectacle, but it had also left behind real emotions, real consequences that I could not fully control. Professionally, the attention brought unexpected opportunities. Requests for interviews, invitations to talk shows, and offers to write columns or appear on podcasts began to roll in. Some offered platforms to share lessons about empowerment. Others wanted the sensational version, the glue story, in full dramatic glory. I had to make choices carefully, balancing my desire for privacy with the opportunity to control my voice. Each decision became a negotiation with both ethics and ego, a reminder that even victory has its responsibilities. And finally, I realized that the glue incident was not just about revenge. It was about transformation. I had been a woman bruised by betrayal, silenced by years of deception, and rendered almost invisible in the life I shared with someone I once trusted. Now I was visible, powerful, heard. The world would continue to talk, to laugh, and to judge, but I had reclaimed the most important thing: my agency. My life was no longer a story written by someone else. I was the narrator, the editor, and the protagonist. The ripples of revenge would continue to spread, but I had emerged from them changed, resilient, and unmistakably whole. A month after the scandal erupted, life in the neighborhood had started to regain its rhythm, or at least pretended to. The whispers had dulled, the gossips had found new prey, and the firefighters' retelling of the glue incident became a barroom legend instead of a breaking headline. But for me, the calm felt deceptive, like the silence after a storm when debris still litters the ground. Every morning, as I brewed my coffee and opened my bakery, I wondered what I had truly set in motion that night. Revenge had given me closure, yes, but it had also set fire to the illusions that had once structured my world: my marriage, my friendships, even my self-image as the ever-patient wife. Now every interaction, every glance, was filtered through a new lens of awareness. People respected me, feared me, and some envied me, but no one saw me as naive anymore. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sky with the soft hues of forgiveness and fire, I saw Ethan standing outside the bakery. His face had thinned, his eyes were haunted, and he looked nothing like the confident man who once strutted through life, believing every lie he told was justified. For a brief second, I almost didn't recognize him.
He waited until the last customer left before approaching me. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke. Maya, I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted to see you one last time, to tell you that what happened, it destroyed me. His voice cracked, and for a fleeting moment, the ghost of the man I once loved flickered through his broken composure. I watched him, feeling neither pity nor satisfaction, just a deep, calm emptiness. You destroyed yourself, Ethan. I just held up the mirror. He nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. I know. I wish I could undo it all. You were my home, Maya. His words might have once shattered me, but now they barely grazed the surface of who I'd become. No, I replied, meeting his gaze steadily. You only realized I was your home when you burned it down. The silence that followed was heavy, almost sacred, not filled with hate or regret, but with a strange understanding that everything had reached its natural end. He left without another word, his figure fading into the soft dusk, and with it, the remnants of the life I once lived. Later that night, I sat on the back porch with a glass of wine, watching the stars emerge one by one. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, a journalist wanting to feature my story as part of a series on women's revenge and empowerment. I smiled faintly. It was tempting, the idea of turning pain into power, betrayal into a platform. But then I remembered the firefighters' startled faces, the chaos, the humiliation, the mess that had started from one small act of fury. Maybe some stories were meant to live in whispers, not headlines. Maybe power wasn't in sharing the story, but in owning its lesson. I declined the offer politely and deleted the message. That night, for the first time in years, I slept without dreams. The ghosts of what-ifs and could-have-beens didn't visit. My mind was quiet, my heart lighter. In the morning, I would open the bakery again, knead the dough with steady hands, and smile at customers who had no idea what the woman behind the counter had lived through. There was no guilt, no lingering need for revenge, only peace, soft and hard-won, like the warmth after surviving a long, cold storm. The fire that had burned through my life hadn't just destroyed, it had cleansed. It had stripped away the illusions, the lies, and even the parts of me that had accepted less than I deserved. In their place stood a woman reborn. Scarred, yes, but strong. My revenge had started with glue, but it ended with freedom. And that, I realized, was the most satisfying ending of all.
Months rolled by like pages in a diary I no longer feared to open. The world had moved on, as it always does, but I had not forgotten. Not the betrayal, not the chaos, and not the quiet rebirth that followed. Life, I learned, has a way of testing you twice, first with pain, then with choice. And this time, I chose peace. My bakery had become more than a business. It was a sanctuary, a place where women gathered not just for pastries but for stories, laughter, and shared resilience. They called me the woman who glued her past shut, half joking, half reverent. And every time I heard it, I smiled. Not because I was proud of the madness, but because it had led me here. On a warm Friday morning, a young woman walked in, nervous, teary-eyed, clutching her phone like a lifeline. "Are you Maya?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The one from the video?" I nodded. She exhaled shakily and said, "I just wanted to say thank you. Watching your story gave me the courage to leave my cheating fiancé. You made me realize revenge doesn't always have to be destructive. Sometimes it's just about walking away stronger." Her words hit me harder than I expected. That was the moment I understood. My story wasn't about glue, humiliation, and not even justice. It was about awakening, for me and maybe for others too. What started as rage had turned into a ripple of empowerment that reached women I'd never met. Later that evening, I stood by my window, the same one that had once framed so many lonely nights, and watched the sunset paint the horizon gold. The world outside was calm again. Ethan had moved out of state, rumor said, and was living quietly somewhere far from the laughter he had once taken for granted. Lila had resurfaced online under a new name, posting motivational quotes about healing and growth. The irony didn't sting anymore. It amused me. We were all moving on, in our own ways, shaped by the fire we had created together. I poured myself a cup of tea and recorded a short message for my online followers, a ritual I'd begun not for fame, but for connection. Sometimes, I said, looking into the camera, life breaks you just to show you what you're made of. I'm not proud of everything I did, but I'm proud that I finally stood up for myself. Remember, revenge fades, but self-respect doesn't. You can rebuild anything as long as you're brave enough to start again. My voice didn't shake. It was steady, calm, and full of quiet conviction, the voice of a woman who had finally found peace in her own reflection. That night, I closed my laptop, turned off the lights, and stepped outside. The air smelled of fresh rain and freedom. The same sky that had once witnessed my heartbreak now seemed to smile back at me. I wasn't the same woman who had once stood in the garage, clutching a tube of glue and shaking with rage. I was someone new, someone who had burned, rebuilt, and bloomed. My revenge had become my rebirth. And as I locked a door behind me, I laughed softly to myself, not in bitterness, but in victory. Because in the end, I didn't just glue two people together. I glued myself back, stronger, wiser, and finally whole.